I had the rare privilege to get to know this great dogman over the phone. At that time frame, it was 1985 and 86, and his health was failing to the point that about 2 years later, he passed away. His courage and his will to live was only surpassed by the courage and gameness of the fighting dogs. He bred and raised with tender loving care. He matched into the best dogmen and dogs of his era. He was gentleman in every sense of the word, even though at this time he was clinically blind and had only one kidney to the point of his legs, opening and draining down on his feet. Also, he had to care for his little frail wife, who both being in their early 80s and becoming senile, the sad facts of aging. But each time I called, he answered sounding like at any minute he might die. As soon as I would tell him who it was, his voice would change and come alive. He would then, with his keen mind and sharp memory, answer my many questions and relate to me many stories of his beloved dogs. I am sure that these memories and dreams plus friend proteges, and at this oint, he had several that kept him alive and as happy as he could be. I know that his wife and he are together in heaven at peace. Here's one of the many stories he told me as best as I can remember it. Hope you enjoy it. Bob many years ago had a good little dog matched in Mississippi into the Mississippi hawk George Sadler, who was somewhat a legend in that part of the country, with both his dogs and his ability to condition them. The match had been going for a short time, both dogs looking good and biting hard. George, from the set of the match, had been down on all fours, banging on the mat, with his hand yelling loudly. Bob, in a firm but polite voice, asked George to discontinue banging the mat and yelling loudly as he and Mrs. Wallace raised the little dog that was tending to spook it somewhat, and he wanted a fair match. George looked up and agreed not to do it anymore, and the match went on. Shortly thereafter, George started doing it agin even harder and louder. Bob agin, in a polite way, reminded him that he agreed earlier not to do it anymore. George said something smart to Bob and continued doing it. Bob immediately told the ref to get the breaking sticks as he was picking up his dog until he could get a firm agreement from George that he would discontinue his banging on the mat and hollering into Bob's dog ear, which he was doing purposely. They argued there in the pit a few minutes before George swore up and down he wouldn't do it again. So the match resumed, not long after George started the same old thing all over again. Bob swore and told me on top of that, when they released the dogs after the break in action, that George's dog got the advantage. Bob was so angry that he told me he cold-clocked George and knocked him out to the point they had to bring a substitute handler into the pit so the match could go on. I asked Bob if his little dog won, and he said very emphatically, "Hell no, he broke my dog's back legs," so I picked him up and asked for a courtesy scratch. He dragged himself across, and his back end was completely gone, and grabbed George's dog, whereas all the people at pitside rose and gave my little dog a standing ovation. In all my years of matching dogs, and there were many, that was the first and last time that happened. Bob was one of the best at his time at medically taking care of his dogs after hard matches, often sitting up with them night after night and doing all the necessary things he learned over the years. I think he had lost the little game dog that under very adverse circumstances, had he gave his master everything he had, including possibly the one most strongest basic instinct, he was whelped with the will to live, signed Gene Thurmond.